I don't have to present Professor Gumbrextis to the audience in Georgia. I'm pretty sure that most of you know him very well. He is professor at Stanford and also honorary doctorate of our university. And it's an honor for us that you are here. And today and tomorrow he will have seminars on a topic which is a fascinating one. It's the topic of Marx and Marxism. And when I say "and," it doesn't necessarily mean a kind of a seamless continuation as far as I understand. But anyways, Professor Gumbrextis is the best person to talk to us about it because he knows the history of European theory, European culture, European art and literature as nobody else in today's world. So I'm very honored and very pleased to give floor to him now.
Well, thanks to you all for coming. It's a beautiful spring afternoon. It's not even cold now. When I arrived today at 4 a.m. at the airport, it was cold and windy. But now it's not cold and windy, just beautiful. So you have to make a decision. And I'm very grateful for you preferring Karl Marx and me over the beautiful afternoon and sunset. I wanted to say you a couple of words about how this topic has emerged. I think it just was Karl Marx. We didn't have any specific fancy title. So I was here for the first time in my life, pretty much almost exactly a year ago, right? A little bit shorter than a year. And I swear by God or by the health of my grandchildren that I'm not saying that always and everywhere, but I completely fell in love with this university, with this city, and with this country. And before my wife and my daughter and I left, I thought I have to propose something that makes it inevitable for the president of the university to invite me again, or that would be a breach of politeness not to invite me again. And then I said, I would love to teach a seminar next year. And maybe he was hesitant and then added something because I had just given a seminar on Karl Marx at Stanford, and I said, well, you know, and maybe that could be interesting given Georgian history, I could do a seminar on Karl Marx. And this was the moment when Giga said yes. I mean, it was almost like proposing, you know, proposing when you ask for marriage, proposing to something and you have to add conditions, and at some point he said yes. So it was not a programmatic discussion that we had a brainstorming what could be the most appropriate topic. It was a random coincidence with, on the one hand, I had just taught a seminar. The title was actually What's Left of Marx? What is left of Marx? Yeah? I taught the seminar. I really wanted to come back, which I hadn't necessarily anticipated when I came for the first time. And I wanted to persuade the president, director of the university to invite. This is how it happened. Now, as today, since I arrived in the morning, there have been several people at the reception of my hotel telling me that this is an interesting topic to talk about. I'm not going to ask you, do you find it's an interesting topic or not? I assume if you found it's completely uninteresting, you wouldn't have come here. May I ask one thing, and this could be embarrassing, but I have no judgment about it, it just interests me. Are there people among you who would consider themselves Marxists? Like, I mean, if you ask me, do I consider myself Catholic? I would say yes, I don't go to church, but I was baptized Catholic. I have a sympathy for the Catholic Church as an institution, and I've never left the Catholic Church. So is there anybody who considers herself or himself Marxist in that sense? Really nobody? No, I didn't have any anticipation. I found that interesting. I mean, it converges with the seminar I taught at Stanford exactly a year ago, which had was a doctoral, seminar for doctoral students. It had 35 enrollment, that is huge at Stanford. Normally it's 10 or so. And I thought there are still some Marxists left at the university on the American West Coast. And I asked the same question at the beginning, and to my surprise, there was nobody who was a Marxist. And that kind of completely derailed my pedagogical strategy, because I do not consider myself a Marxist. There was a time in my life when I would have been ambitious to be a Marxist, but I thought it would be good for the seminar to have a couple of Marxists and we get into a fight every week. But we never got into a fight. So there's literally nobody. I could use a Marxist. No? Okay. Thank you. There are one Marxist. Okay. So stay in the front row today and tomorrow, so I have you as a point of reference. Now, when I was doing this seminar, what's left of Marx, what intentions did I have? I mean, I have to say that people found this was a genius title of a seminar because it had two meanings. Think about it, what's left of Marx. The meaning that I had not thought about it is what is politically in the political spectrum left of Marx. Yeah, so is there a theory that's further out on the left than Marx? I mean, I have to admit, and maybe this is telling about my own political position, I hadn't even thought about that. So the title was much better than I had intended it to be. I mean, what I was interested in were aspects, three aspects really, on what is left of Marx and what is left of Marxism, although I wouldn't take Marx and Marxism as synonymous. Yeah? I mean, two things. One question that I had, and these three questions are also questions that I would like to propose for these two seminar sessions, is, if you want, not even in the metaphorical sense, archaeological. I mean, are there any remnants, things left, functional or dysfunctional, from Marx reception? That would mainly be things mediated through Marxism as an institution. And I mean, if one drives through Tbilisi, there are lots of buildings, for example, that you could clearly identify as being leftovers from a certain style, architectural style, institutional style. That was the style of the Soviet Union and Georgia being a Soviet republic. Yeah? I mean, or, you know, very strong, I was there when I was here a year ago, the Stalin Museum in Gory would be something like that. But also, is there intellectually anything left? Yeah? I mean, really archaeological, that's the first question. I mean, that is not intellectually terribly exciting, but in a time which I think, and hopefully we get into a fight about that, has left Marxism behind. I do not believe personally that it is still a viable option, but that doesn't mean I'm right. I'm just putting the cards on the table. That can be an interesting question. What's left of that movement? What's left of that movement that I would like to describe as the most generous, most optimistic utopia about what human life can be that humankind has ever invented. I do not know any more generous utopia. And generous, I mean, if you ask me whether there was any virtue I like, I think the only one that I could come up with would be generosity. And I think the basic spirit of Marxism and of Marxist thought was very generous. But I think it was not only the most beautiful, the most generous utopia that had ever been invented, I think it was also the most devastatingly failed and costly failed experiment that humankind ever ran. I mean, there was no experiment that had more victims and that was more devastating and long-term devastating for the societies involved. And I don't believe it was random. Nevertheless, I mean, the question is there what's left of that time? And my second question is there something left not only in this archaeological sense, but is there something left that one could say is still inspirational for us? I could imagine that this would be, see how good it was that there was at least one Marxist now to address you all the time. Is there something left in the legacy of Marx, of Karl Marx, that could be inspirational today. Not only politically, yeah, but also inspirational for analysis. For example, in that seminar that I was mentioning, we dedicated 20 minutes every week to analyze with Marxist concepts a phenomenon, an economic phenomenon that was a year ago still very new in California. That was Uber. Does everybody know what Uber is? I mean, this privately run taxis. So we tried to analyze the Uber phenomenon strictly with Marxist categories. And I would say, to my surprise, it turned out that with a few exceptions that went well. This was a good terminology to do an analysis, not an ideological analysis, but what is happening with Uber. Yeah? So in that broad sense, is there intellectual use value? Are there things where where Marxist concepts can still be useful? Is there inspirational power? Yeah? Can we say that certain Marx concepts can be inspirational for you? So that is my second question. Was my second question in the seminar, but also a second question that I want to propose here. And although, as you see, I'm not quite able to maintain that well myself, but I would propose a distinction here between Marxist and Marxian. Yeah? Marxist would always refer to the ideology, and I'm not associating anything negative with ideology, but Marxism would be the edifice, institution erected not so much by Marx, but more by Engels than by Marx, and then by state Marxism, trying to be very coherent. And once again, when I say ideology, I do not necessarily associate anything negative. And when I say Marxian, I'm not the only one who uses this concept. I refer to phenomena, concepts, arguments, proposals that belong to the work and the legacy of Marx without ever having become Marxist. Is that clear? So there might be certain things, certain concepts that are Marxian and never made it, never become part of Marxism. For example, to give you one example, I will explain that later today. I think the Capital needs a synchronic reading, needs a reading that does not go along the lines of the history of class struggle, because I think it's incompatible actually with an Hegelian epistemology, and that would be Marxian, because I mean that did not become part of Marxism, because Marxism tried to be Hegelian throughout. I mean Hegelian, the Marxist, is that clear? So that would be a Marxian potential. That's the second point. Thirdly, and that is already a little bit implicit in my second point, I would try to separate as much as possible Marx as a historical protagonist, as a historical character, Marx as the author of a work on the one hand, and Marxism on the other hand. Once again, not because I believe that everything that one can say about Marxism was evil, horrible, conspiracy and so forth, and Marx was very wonderful and a victim. But nevertheless, because there are certain things about Marx, about Marx's work that can be very interesting and that do not belong to Marxism. Okay, so the three intentions are archaeology of the remnants of Marx and Marxism. B, is there anything inspirational Marxian, mainly, in any sense? It's not so much about rescuing Marxism, is there anything that can still an inspirational power? And thirdly, is it possible to keep Marx and Marxism apart? So that would be the agenda for this seminar. Is that clear to everybody? I'm saying that, I mean, not that this is very complex, but I mean, you follow. Right? I mean, let me tell you my own, very briefly, my own history biographically with mainly Marxism, so that you know where I'm coming from. So I was born in 1948. I was brought up in West Germany. I mean, actually, the German partition started as if I had triggered it 3 days after I was born. It started with the introduction of the DM, the D-Mark, the Westmark, and that happened on not 3 days, 5 days. That happened on June 20th, 1948. I was born on June 15th. So I was brought up in West Germany, and politically that means I was brought up under American occupation. Now, American occupation, like British occupation in West Germany, was not a bad and repressive thing, but nevertheless it was, ideologically speaking, bringing up under, there was no chance that Marxism could ever have become part of my curriculum, at elementary school or in high school. So, for people my generation born in Western Germany, Marxism had the mystique of being the other. From the time on that we were teenagers, we felt that Marxism would be very appealing, because it was never forbidden really, but it was the other which you were not supposed to do. And then when I was 17 years old, 17, for random reasons, I spent a long summer in India, and like I think any 17-year-old who has a heart, was absolutely touched and shocked by the misery in society. So when I came back to Germany after 7 or 8 weeks in India, I felt, and I'm quoting the German poet Rilke, my life has to change. And then two things happened. The one thing that was very short-lived, I went to church again, because I thought that would maybe, if I would pray for all these poor people in India, that would help. To my knowledge, it didn't help much, but anyway, I went to church again. And I wanted to be a Marxist, because I thought maybe that is this wonderful general theory that could help poor people, for example, in India. So when I enrolled at the university in 1967, on the day that I enrolled, before I even enrolled at the university, I became a member of the Marxist Student Union, and I had to sign a document as if this was a religious faith, that I herewith confirmed that I believed that Marxism was the only true and scientific explanation of the universe. So this was the SDS, Sozialistischer Deutscher Studentenbund, and I had to sign, like a declaration of faith, that I believed that Marxism was the only truthful and scientific world explanation. And I signed that, and I was very enthusiastic, and only after that I enrolled at the university. And I was very enthusiastic, and I attended all the meetings that we had at the Marxist chapter, as they called it. This was a very Marxist word for chapter. And then something weird happened. I mean, very strange, take into account that I'm an American citizen today. In 1968, 1 year into my university study, we protested against the Vietnam War at the American consulate at Munich. So we threw stones at the American consulate at Munich, nothing happened. But then we got arrested by the police. And we were enthusiastic that we got arrested by the police. That was so beautiful, because that meant we were heroes, we were potential victims. And they locked us up into the gym of a gymnasium, of a high school. And that was even better, because we thought now soon we will be tortured and maybe executed. And you all know this painting by Delacroix, La Liberté dans les barricades. I mean, I would look different if I opened my T-shirt now, but we had this very feeling, and we were singing for some reason the hymn of the Italian Socialist Party, Bandera Rossa, and all of a sudden a cop comes in, a policeman comes in, and says, it was in Munich, with a very heavy southern German accent, "Is Mr. Gumbrext here?" I said, "Yes," and I was terribly proud, because I thought I would be the first to be executed. And I said, "Yeah, it's me." And said, "Okay, we just got a call from the Ministry of Police, you can go home." This was, of course, horrible. I would have much preferred to die on the spot than to be released. But I knew what the reason was. Because I had a stipend from the Bavarian state. Bavaria being a federal state in Germany, I had a stipend from the Bavarian state. And how can I say that without bragging? It was a very privileged stipend. Every year until the present day, 5 people who graduate from high school in the state get this stipend. And I also knew that the director of this stipend was the director of the Bavarian police. And he would check every day the list of students who got arrested. and he had seen my name on the list and immediately called, he has to be released because this would be a dark stain on the glorious aura of the fellowship. So I went home and I felt really bad. And the next morning I went to the chapter of the Communist Student Organization, and I was being accused. So it was said that I had betrayed the working class by being, literally, by being released, and that I had to do self-critique, so to speak, to flagellate myself. And I said, everybody knows what's going on, everybody knows that I have this stipend, everybody knows that the police chief of Bavaria and so forth, no, you are a traitor. You have betrayed the working class. And I said, what does this have to do with the working class? Actually, I said, what the fuck does this have to do with the working class? If you forgive my language. Okay, so I was punished to print 500 posters calling for a general strike. That would have been bad enough to print 500, okay, or good enough in red color. But I was punished to print them on a printing machine that was for art prints. You get my point? I mean, where you do normally art, which made it much more difficult. So it took me 3 days to print 500 copies, which would normally have taken me 50 minutes. And during those 3 days that I was doing that, I lost my Marxist faith. Yeah, because I thought, if it is so idiotic that they call me a traitor of the working class for something that I had nothing to do with, and then I had to do this punishment, which makes no sense at all. I mean, it's just a waste of time. I don't like it anymore. But, and that's where I wanted to go, it took me I was then 21 years old, it took me at least 15 more years to confess that I was not a Marxist. I mean, this is just maybe interesting for people here from Georgia, especially for the older people. That was very different from here. If you were a Western intellectual in the 1960s and 1970s, it was very, very difficult to confess that you were not a Marxist. Yeah? So my bad faith was actually that for the longest time in my life, I pretended to be a Marxist. I mean, not for the longest time, for a long time. And only, I don't know, in the early 80s, I dared to say, well, I'm of the extreme left, but I'm not a Marxist. So that's kind of my short history with Marxism. The point I want to make as a preface for the seminar, I am at this point not a believer in Marxism. I also am not a believer in a necessary renaissance of Marxism. I'm not doing this seminar because I want to convince you that Marxism deserves one more chance. I'm also not, to my knowledge, an anti-Marxist ideologue. Yeah? I mean, if it turned out that some political party or some politician had a good, convincing use of some Marxist elements, that would be fine. Get my point? I don't have a political agenda for this seminar. It's really an intellectual agenda that is open for political usage. I mean, at this point, if you ask me for my political conviction, I would quote Sir Winston Churchill, who says, we all know that the worst political system that we have is Western-style parliamentary democracy. The bad thing is that all the others are even worse. Yeah? So I would subscribe that, because in a Western-style parliamentary democracy, you can legally elect Hitler Chancellor of Germany or Donald Trump President of the United States. He was completely legally elected. I mean, all these discussions was not legal are bullshit. In the United States, you can become president without having the majority of the votes. That's completely legal, and everybody knows that. So it is a system with flaws, but I think the system works relatively fine. I have no ideology about that. If somebody in the course of the seminar convinces me that a new, different version of Marxism would be better, I would not necessarily resist. So much as a preface for the seminar. Let me try you to now say, if we get really in the topic, what my program is for today and for tomorrow. And if you find it totally boring, then you can leave right away. No, I mean, it's nicer to talk to 20 people who are really interested than to 100 who stay out of politeness. I hope that you stay all because you're passionate about it. So today I would like to start with it's bad intellectual taste, but I think it can be helpful, with a biographical sketch about Marx that tells you something about the historical environment in which his work was emerging, and tells you also something about the influences. So that first part will be biographical. In that biographical part, I also will try to develop a hypothesis of what was Marx's main motivation. I mean, why was he so obsessed with the type of philosophy that he developed throughout his life? That's the first part. In the second part, I want to talk about the intellectual epistemological environment in which Marxism emerged, and that is largely, and I apologize, some of you may have heard that in a different version last year, what I call the historical worldview. You call that in German das historische Weltbild. And it is that kind of worldview that became so heavily institutionalized in the Western world in the early 19th century that people thought that is the truth about the world as it is. So that's the historical worldview. And the historical worldview, whose main philosopher is Hegel. You could say that the system of the Hegelian philosophy is a systematization, a systematic spelling out, painting out of the historical worldview. And everybody knows that the historical worldview really became the matrix of Marx's philosophy. Okay? So, second part, historical worldview and Hegel as dominant historical environment. And then I want to make a separation and talk in the third part about Marx's development of the theory of the class struggle. And that would be the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. And I want to make a sharp distinction between that as a third part and a fourth part, in which I want to talk about the Kapital and the economic manuscripts that began to emerge in the 1860s, which I think are epistemologically profoundly different from the history of the class struggle, which I also believe, and we may have a discussion about that, never really became part of Marxism. So that is interesting for you, because without any doubt there are people here who know more about Marxism than I do. I think that epistemologically speaking, and when I'm saying epistemology, I mean the structure or the architecture of knowledge. Epistemologically speaking, the Kapital never became part of Marxism. And the Kapital in that sense has been there in latency forever. Some of you may know that there was one exception, this French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, in the mid-late 1960s, who wrote this book, To Read Marx, to lire le Capital, to read the Capital, who wanted a structural analysis of the Capital. That was a very tempting book for a short time, but it became history. I mean, nobody really did it. You get my point? So this was the first time that I thought I had an intellectual reaction on your faces when I was saying that I believe there's an epistemological discontinuity between the history of the class struggle and the Kapital, and not only the Kapital, also the Grundrisse, all those so-called economic manuscripts of the last 20 years of Marxist production. And I also believe that the Kapital never really became part of Marxism. And I'm saying that, of course, Marxists quoted the Kapital all the time, individual sentences. But I think in Marxism, the ideology, mythology, whatever you want to call it, of the history of the class struggle is so dominant that there was never really space for the epistemological project of the Kapital. Now don't get me wrong, this is not like saying, oh my God, Kapital is this innocent, wonderful thing that nobody has ever discovered. I don't think it's the answer to all the questions that we have, but yes, I do think it is profoundly different from the history of the class struggle. And it's not black and white, and one is good, one is evil, but I insist on the discontinuity. That's the program for today. Program for tomorrow, I will develop the hypothesis at the beginning that has actually nothing to do with Marxism, or seems to have nothing to do, And that is that I believe that today, at least in our everyday and globally, we are no longer living in the worldview of the historical worldview. That epistemology that emerged in the early 19th century, that epistemology of which Michel Foucault said that Marx is swimming in the historical worldview like a fish in the water, and that was neither negative nor positive, it was just saying it comes out of that context. I believe that this is no longer our worldview today. Not because we have found something better, but because I think such developments and emergences of worldviews are out of our control. It happens, and there's not much we can do about it. So I think in our everyday, nobody believes, embraces the historical worldview anymore. And that is the reason why I believe that we can look for remnants of Marxism. We can look for inspirational elements or atoms, but that there is no resurrection and renaissance possible. Now, that is my point of view that I try to argue. And if you are against that, I want to make a counter-argument. I'm not saying that you're evil or you will be excluded from the seminar. I hope that happens, but that's what I'm trying to develop. And the other parts tomorrow will be the reception history of Marxism. And that is Marxism. That today would be rather Marx, tomorrow would be rather Marxism. The reception history is starting with Engels, because as some of you know, the decisive text for the emergence of Marxism and for the reception of Marx in Eastern Europe, mainly in the Russian Empire, was a text by Engels called the Anti-Düring. A text written against the competing philosophers, so to speak, in which Engels really creates a coherent ideology out of the rather centrifugal intuitions of Marx. That is the first stage. In the second stage, I will try to describe Marxism as a state ideology, and I will describe that in deliberate close reference to monotheistic religions. I think that the way state Marxism was handled has a great similarity with monotheistic religions, and that is not a negative criticism. I actually, while I don't go to any church or synagogue regularly, I greatly appreciate monotheistic religions. But I think there's a reading, there's a type of philology, a type of hermeneutics that is not only similar to monotheistic religions, I think that is the type of reading. I will then, in the third place, talk about so-called revisionist Marxisms, things like the Frankfurt School, Habermas, etc., centrifugal Marxisms. I mean, this is rather more about the inspirational power of Marx. Yeah? I mean, whether Habermas or the Frankfurt School or Adorno or Benjamin were really Marxist or not, I mean, it depends on whether you want them to be Marxist or not. Yeah? And if you deliberately want Benjamin to be a Marxist, I allow you to declare him a Marxist. I don't think it makes much sense, but it's fine with me. I mean, you can also say, you know, he was latently homosexual. He was probably not, but latently, I mean, or latently lesbian if you want. You get my point. I mean, I'm saying that because there's a rumor floating around in Germany now that he was a hermaphrodite. I don't know whether it helps or not to know that he was maybe a hermaphrodite. Okay. Benjamin always produces such rumors, right? I mean, there's always a secret about Benjamin. Anyway, I will talk about revisionist Marxism, and then we will come to this final question. I'm curious about that. A kind of evaluation. So what's left of Marxism today, in the double sense of what's left? I mean, I kind of know of how I would answer this question at this point, but I hope that we do get into a discussion about it. And that what I would answer now will be different from what I will be able to answer, or what we will be able to answer in 24 hours, okay? So, and don't say fasten your seatbelts because it's not so difficult, but I want to propose two rules. So, I will lecture for another, well, how much time do you have? An hour and 15 minutes then? So for another 50 minutes, let's say. So that's long, but I know that people in Georgia are very patient. Now, if at some point you feel individually that you will not be able to follow what I will say if you don't understand the point I'm making, yeah? Please interrupt me, because once again I think there's nothing more horrible than thinking that all people are bored because you don't follow anymore. If, however, you think that what I'm saying either deserves the Nobel Award, but there is no Nobel Award for intellectual history, or is absolutely wrong, or you really want to make a counter-argument, let's wait for the discussion after the lecture. There will be time for that. So just do interrupt me anytime if you technically don't understand the point. Yeah? Or if I get a name or a number completely wrong. Okay. So if these rules are agreed upon, I'd like to tell you something about Marx's biography. I know that talking about biography still has an aura of being bad intellectual taste, but A, I like it a lot. I like biographies. And B, I've never understood why it would be bad intellectual taste, because of course necessarily, if you talk about an author or an intellectual like Marx, I mean, the biography necessarily is a point of intersection of many influences. In the biography, things come together, so to speak. So, I mean, talking about the biography is a condensed way of talking about the historical environment. Also, I want to speak, when I talk about the biography, of what may have motivated Marx. So, 5 parts about the biography, 5 remarks I want to make. The first one is, Marx was born in 1818, easy to remember. Next year you will read that endlessly because it will be the 200th anniversary of his birth. He was born in the German city, a town of 20,000 then, of 100,000 today, Trier. That is on the German map very close to Luxembourg. It's at 30 kilometers from Luxembourg, 40 kilometers. So northwestern Germany, it's very northwestern Germany. Both his parents came from rabbinic families. So there was a long tradition of rabbis in his father's genealogy. His father actually was the first family father in the family tradition who was not a rabbi in Germany, and his mother was also from a rabbinic family in Holland. So his mother never learned to write, how to write in German. We, of course, as we don't have sound records, we don't know much about how she read German. But this was a two rabbinic families. And that was very normal in the European Jewish context, that you had these remote marriages. I mean, a good rabbinic family would marry their daughter to the son of a good rabbinic family in Italy or in Germany. That was quite standard. Now, 1818 means that Marx was born 3 years after the Vienna Congress of 1815, which basically tried to set back the clock of the European bourgeois revolutions. To set back the clock above all of the revolutions that had the most impact, the French Revolution of 1789, and that meant concretely for Marx's family that the complete emancipation of Jews, due to the principle of equality legally, not equality financially, was no longer existing. So when Marx was born, the family of his parents, after several decades in which Jews had the same rights as everybody, actually definitely in France, but also in some of these Western German states, the clock was set back and they did not have the same rights. 2 examples for that. Several months after Marx's birth, his father decided to convert to Lutheranism. And actually all 5 children in the mid-1920s were baptized Lutheran, and they were never circumcised. Now, why did Marx's father do that? He could have gotten away without doing that, but he had what we would call in present-day English a law firm. He was relatively wealthy, and it would have been very clear that he would not have found enough clients in the climate of restoration, being a very good lawyer seemingly, had he not converted to Lutheranism. Why am I insisting so much Lutheranism? Because Lutheranism may have contained in this act of assimilation a tiny component of resistance. Because, as you may know, in Germany there are but two denominations until the present day. You are either Catholic or Lutheran. And the environment of Trier, northwestern Germany, is completely Catholic. So you get my point, if you convert to Christianity but do not become Catholic, you maintain a certain distance. Yeah? So that is one story. A second story, it is famous, and we have many documents from fellow students, that Marx in the gymnasium, and there was no university in Trier, and there was no university around, so the gymnasium was the high school, was the intellectual institution. He was an absolute star student. He had very good grades, he was very brilliant, all his professors were raving about him. But Marx, sounds strange, he never became what is officially called in German Klassenbester. Yeah, until 1945, in each grade at the German gymnasium, there was an award for the best student. Marx never got this award. Guess why? Marx never got this award, and also then Marx fell in love with a girl from a very good family, semi-noble family, Jenny von Westphalen. She fell in love with him, but he could only propose 13 years later, when A, her family was in a financial crisis, and B, he had acquired a doctorate. Yeah? Had he not been Jewish, it would have been an honor for her family to have him as a political son and to have him in the family. You get my point? I mean, this was... So, my point is that I'm deeply convinced, that this does not only go back to biography, that the driving force in all of Marx's life and all of Marx's intellectual work is the question of justice, not of equality, of justice. Of justice, capital J, not of justice so much in the sense of a court of law, but of justice in the sense, what is my objective value? Yeah? What is my value if I was not from a Jewish family? So I don't think it was so much the insistence on equality. I have to be treated like everybody else, but it was rather the proud awareness that he was particularly intelligent, particularly hardworking, and he never got the equivalent of that. You get my point? For me, that explains that the obsessive concept in all of Marx, and that is no different from the early Marx, the very early Marx, and the very late Marx. What do you think is the obsessive concept in Marx's life that goes throughout his life?
Oppression. I would think oppression.
I don't think so. I think value. I mean value in every sense. Yeah? I mean, you know, commodity, which you can say is a central concept. But commodity, of course, is an object that becomes the intersection of values. And there are multiple concepts of values. Use value, banking value, personal value, and so forth. There's an endless proliferation of hyphenated values concept in Marx. And my point is that the Marxist misunderstanding was that the insistence of value was an insistence on economic equality. There is not a single quote in Marx that says that proletarians should earn the same as, or lawyers should earn the same as politicians. That is never the question. The question is, what is the just value of proletarian work? Of the work of who sells and organizes a factory. He doesn't say all these people should die. Whether he thinks they should make more money or less money, or that their work has a greater worth or not, is also not clear. The question is, what is the objective value of 8 hours or 12 hours of factory work? Get my point? I mean, he never got to the point of saying the value is X, Y, Z. To my knowledge, I mean, nobody has probably read every line of Marx, or those people are dying out now, but you get my point. There is no central ideological or philosophical point in Marx that says everybody should earn the same. But there is an obsession with the objective value. Yeah? What is the objective value of me doing the seminar here? What is the objective value of the seminar for you? The use value for you? The symbolic value for you that the president sees that you are coming? What is the objective value of what I'm doing for the university, and so forth and so forth. Yeah? What would be the objectively fair tax withholding of the Republic of Georgia on a, no, and these would be Marxist questions, but clearly you see the answer is not homogeneous. Flat rate of 10% or something like that. I think this is why I'm emphasizing justice. The question is, what are you? And what is the work that you are doing worth? What is an institution worth? There has to be, that is Marx's obsession, there has to be the objective criterion for that. Whether it is possible to have such an objective criterion, I say, and I just mean it, I'm not saying euphemistically, I doubt. I don't think one will ever find an objective measure for that. And yet, I do think that this is the central drive in Marx's life. And that's what I mean when I'm saying the central motivation in Marx is not social equality. It would be maybe beautiful if it was social equality, but there is no textual or biographical evidence that it was social equality. I think the obsessive motivation is objective value. And my biographical interpretation would be that comes from the feeling, from the trauma of being constantly and institutionally undervalued in his youth. Yeah? Okay, that is my starting point, and it's a relatively important point for me. Now, third point biographically, what were, in terms of history of ideas, impacts, inspirations for Marx before he ever got in touch with Hegel? I mean, everybody knows, of course, that Hegel's philosophy is the matrix for Marx's thought, and I think while this is banal, it is nevertheless true. But before that, what was inspiration for him? Let me mention the following things. In the first place, of course, the values of the French Revolution. Now, what most people do not know, I mean, you all know this trias of the French state today, liberté, égalité, fraternité. People normally don't really know what to do with fraternité. I mean, the best translation of fraternité for today would be solidarity. That's what fraternité means. Fraternité did not exist as a concept and was not part of this lemma before 1848. So when Marx was young, the two values of the bourgeois revolutions were liberty and equality. Liberty definitely in the sense of individual liberty, that of course meant independence from the aristocracy, there was no social hierarchy institutionalized, and equality above all, equality before the law. Sometimes, but that was very seldom, there was a connotation of financial equality that existed in Marx's time, but it was above all equality before the law. These were the two volumes that his father embraced. His father felt he had to have the liberty as a former Jew, a converted Jew, to run a law firm, to speak at court with the same rights and the same prestige as somebody who was not Jewish. Yeah, that was liberty and equality, but solidarity, fraternité, that you had to fraternize, to feel solidarity with somebody who was in worse social conditions than you, was not part of the conceptual horizon of the 1820s, 1830s when Marx was growing up. I'm not saying it's a bad concept, I'm just stating the historical fact. So the two values of the French Revolution. Secondly, some of you may know that medieval studies, the reconstruction of medieval culture, emerged actually out of European Romanticism. in the early 19th century. You may have heard of the Grimm brothers, and some of you may know that the house and fairy tales of the Grimm brothers are basically not written for children. This was the result of anthropological research to reconstruct in the Middle Ages what the Grimms imagined to be the German soul, the soul of the German nation. And in that sense, there were rather romantic imaginations than research results of forms of medieval communal life circulating in Germany. And Marx already in high school had a very soft spot for that. So he felt that there were Christian life forms, there were guilds in late medieval cities. There were, for example, forms like, if you know this opera by Richard Wagner, which I find is horrible, but that doesn't matter, Die Meistersinger, that guilds, yeah, that forms of a medieval living together that was different and less hierarchical than living together in his own time. That was another very strong, very important inspiration for Marx. Thirdly, utopian socialism. Some of you may know names like Proudhon, for example. That was actually paradoxically similar to those remnants from the Middle Ages. Yeah? So this was also an ideal of a different communal life. If we read Proudhon today, for example, it reads actually like the description of a secular monastery. People live together, everybody gets up at the same time, everybody has lunch together, they do work together, etc., etc. But this utopian socialism was inspirational for Marx too. What is different from his own theory, that it has absolutely no historical mediation. That doesn't say, oh, I mean, it is utopian because it didn't exist in his time, but nobody like Proudhon will say, well, it will emerge within the next 200 years, or it will emerge based on certain regular changes in history. That didn't exist. Is that clear?
I'm not quite sure what historical mediation is in this context.
Well, I mean simply, if you read Proudhon, for example, you have an image of what communal life or human life should be. Sometimes a very appealing and interesting image, but different from developed Marxism. You don't have a theory how you get there from the present day state. I mean, basically the implication is if all humans are of goodwill, we will create those new cities or those new life forms, but there's no theory, because of course Marxism tries to prove that necessarily due to the regularities of the history of class struggle, you will get to a class-free society. That such an element, I would call it a mythology, is not contained in utopian socialism. So these are 3 out of the 5 inspirations that I wanted to mention. Then Marx wrote actually a dissertation, and he got his PhD in 1842, so at age 24, on the pre-Socratics. How much the pre-Socratics as pre-Socratics inspired him is difficult. But, and this is my fifth and last remark, and I find that quite interesting, in the preface to his dissertation, he expresses the belief, and that is very beautiful and moving, not very realistic, that if reality gets in touch with philosophy, philosophy can change reality. So it feels a little bit like chemotherapy or something like that. Yeah, I mean, so there is a bad social situation, I mean, undesirable social situation, and if you only get this undesirable social situation close enough with philosophy, we would today say with philosophical discourses, that will change society. Yeah? I mean, I'm not blaming him, but there was a very profound belief, very remote from us today, I would say, unfortunately, that philosophy had very clearly a practical function. So if this was a part briefly about Marx's motivation, about early influences, let me say a couple of things about how his life went on. So he enrolled as a student of law, actually, not philosophy, of English, of the English language. There was not much of literary criticism, as we would say today, and of Italian. He wanted to learn Italian but never really learned it, at the University of Bonn. That is not too far away from his hometown, still on the Rhine River. I mean, Bonn, the former capital before 1989. In Bonn, he got into, you know, there still exists at German university, sword fighting corporations, student corporations. You know that? They fight with sharp swords until the present day. It's always half legal, half illegal. He got into that, he was drinking too much, his father was concerned about him. So that meant that after one semester at Bonn, he went to Berlin. He went to Berlin, and the main influence in Berlin from 1936 on was actually what people call, and I will explain that more later on, left Hegelianism. Left Hegelianism is a type of Hegel's philosophy, and reading of Hegel's philosophy, that will say philosophy has not come to an end yet. You may know that Hegel thought that history had come to an end in his own philosophy, modestly, and in the Prussian state. That it was in his own philosophy and the Prussian state of his time that spirit and matter had been reunited again on a reflexive level. Now, left Hegelianism, a few years after Hegel's death, said that Hegel's philosophy will be the solution to all relevant questions, except for one question, that Hegel was wrong believing that history already had come to its end in his philosophy. That the future was still open, and based on Hegel's philosophy, one could change the future. That, of course, was the more political version. So as far as we know, Marx didn't go to the university much at Berlin anymore. He was hanging out, he was frequenting intellectual circles of left Hegelianism at the University of Berlin, and Hegel became increasingly important for him. His idea was to have an academic career. His idea was to have an academic career, to become a professor of philosophy. Yeah? This is why he wrote his dissertation on the pre-Socratics. And then in 1838, two things happened. First, his father died, and that meant his financial situation drastically changed. And secondly, the young professor that had been his mentor, his Doktorvater, as you say in German, his name was Bauer, got demoted from the university for political reasons. That was Restoration. So all of a sudden, Marx did not have any academic authority who would support him. Yeah? So this was the situation in 1838. The consequence was that Marx finished his PhD at the University of Jena, not at Berlin, without any hope for an academic career, believing, as it is true unto the present day, at least in Germany, that to have a doctor in front of your name, the title, would give you some prestige and would be good for any career. But from 1838 on, Marx had to earn money, had to make a living. And that was the reason why from 1838 on he became a young and very fast famous political journalist. And for those among you who are able to read German, I don't know how many among you can read German, I would strongly recommend you to read whichever early Marx text you can read. Not so much because their ideological value, but because I believe he's one of the 10 greatest prose authors of German language ever. Yeah? And I start with Luther. I mean, it's absolutely, the language has a beauty a power that is absolutely amazing, that I did not realize when I was young and was reading from an ideological point of view. So very soon became a well-known young political journalist who analyzed political situations within Prussia, and he was actually quickly successful, famous and not wealthy, but well-to-do enough that in 1843 he could propose finally to Jenny von Westphalen. I mean, this was very late. I mean, he had been waiting just because he was a Jewish boy and he did not belong to the rest of the crowd. So he was a journalist. 1843 he was successful, but he was increasingly becoming politically suspicious, that he was not in conformity with what the Prussian state expected from a journalist, and that is why he emigrated in 1843 to France, to the July Republic, to the constitutional monarchy in France, believing that this would be a more liberal environment. And interestingly, he never really made many contacts with French people. He met in France, in Paris, a number of German intellectuals who, for the same reason, had left Germany. And the two most famous of them were the German poet Heinrich Heine, like Marx, from an assimilated Jewish German background, and the other one was Friedrich Engels. I mean, Friedrich Engels being the very wealthy son of a factory owner. Yeah? They had not been forced to leave Germany. In the first place, Germany as a state didn't exist. Does anybody know when Germany began to exist really as a state? Huh? 1871, after the German-French War. There was never a state named Germany before that. Yeah, 1843, there was no Germany. They had left Germany, but they had to leave France very soon. Also because they were politically suspicious. In 1844, Marx and Engels went to Brussels, to Belgium. And it was actually in Brussels and Belgium where the young journalists first got in touch with what we may call the workers' movement. Yeah? There were fraternities, there were workers' organizations. One would imagine there were very few workers there, but there were bourgeois intellectuals who had these feelings of solidarity with workers. Yeah? And Marx, due to his talent, to his rhetorical talent, soon became eminent in this group. And this is a time that we call in history pre-48. You know, this European revolutionary year of 1848, the first European revolutions with a participation of the working class. I'm not saying the working class became the subject, but this is the first time that factory workers went on the streets in 1848. And actually, in January 1848, the Communist Federation, that was the name, European Communist Federation, commissioned Marx to write the Communist Manifesto, which remained until this present day probably his most famous text. The Communist Manifesto, which had a certain impact in that revolutionary year and gave Marx a name which was ambiguous because it made him famous on the one hand, but it made him also generally suspicious with the police. So what is he doing in this 1848 revolutionary year? People also call it the Revolution of March. Revolutions normally in the Northern Hemisphere start in the summer, in June or July. It's empirically true when it is warm, but the March Revolution was exceptional. Now, Marx had already developed a certain rudimentary theory of the class struggle in that year. He went back to Germany because all of a sudden Germany looked like more liberal, and he began to write articles prognosticating the end of the revolutionary year. And in 1848 Marx predicted that a class-free society would be realized by the end of the year, by the end of 1848. That, of course, cost him a lot of prestige when the year was over. I I mean, as we know, we are still waiting for the class-free society today, and this is way after December 1848. Yeah? So, I would say the time between 1843 and 1848 is the time in which Marx develops the theory, the philosophy of the class struggle, in which he develops a contact or several contacts with proletarian parties. He is never an eminent member, he is rather somebody who is the brain of these parties. A year, finally, 1848, in which he expects the communist revolution to arrive, and the communist revolution doesn't arrive. Now, this political exposure and prognostic failure are the reasons why Marx in 1849 emigrated to England, where he died at London in 1883, and you could say the entire second half of Marx's life, actually more than 50% of his life, he lived in England, and I would not necessarily call it an English exile, because he could have stayed in Germany. He occasionally came back to Germany, but for some reason he liked this distance. Maybe he also thought that the British workers' movement was more developed. So you see, there are so far two larger stages of Marx's life. I mean, the upbringing with his parents and the first influences, then this extremely productive time between 1835 and 1848, where he inhales left-wing Marxism and where he develops the theory of the class struggle, and finally, the years following 1848, where he spends literally day after day in the reading room of the British Library and works the first few years, actually until 1850-51, on a revision of the theory of the class struggle. Yeah? I mean, so he was seemingly capable of self-correcting, because he realized that the theory of the class struggle as he had developed it did not function as a prognostic tool. All the prognostics that he had been producing turned out to be wrong. I mean, there was no, revolution was not finished by December 1848. So he revised the theory of the class struggle, and he revised it in two ways. A, he added several class categories to the existing class categories. The original theory of the class struggle had basically three classes: aristocracy, bourgeoisie, and proletariat. Yeah? And Marx writes that probably this was not complex enough, and that's why he added tendentially the petit bourgeoisie and the lumpenproletariat. Yeah? The lumpenproletariat not being a lower proletariat below factory workers, but the lumpenproletariat being what you would call in French demi-monde. I mean, people coming from all different types of society, people being relatively close to ideological production. And he added the distinction between infrastructure and superstructure. Between infrastructure and superstructure, I mean, mainly the concept of superstructure, namely the concept of ideologies. And the use was to say that sometimes convictions that people have, ideologies that exist, can either speed up or slow down the rhythm of the history of the class struggle. So he basically says there should have been a proletarian revolution in 1848, but as there were very strong romantic or pseudo-romantic ideologies in the air, that slowed down the revolution of the rhythm of the class struggle. Is that clear? So that's what Marx did, I would say, until 1852. There's this famous text on the 18th Brumaire analyzing the French situation. I think this is where the history of the class struggle comes to an ending. From then on, the way he worked in the British Library really changed, and one can document that, because until the present day, one can document which books he was checking out every day. And it is interesting that from the early 50s on, what Marx was checking out were all of a sudden economic documents. Yeah, he wasn't reading that much philosophy and history anymore, but he was interested in how early industrial enterprises in Manchester were running their business. Yeah? So Marx was beginning to develop an exclusively, I would say, an exclusively economy-focused theory. And the first volume that emerged from that was the first volume of 1862 of Das Kapital, which was one of those books that immediately left a great impact on many important intellectuals, but didn't sell well. I mean, it took 12 years until the first 1,000 copies of Das Kapital were sold, in a time where more books were sold, where the print runs of intellectual books were higher than today. Yeah, so 1,000 books sold for an intellectual book was less in the 1860s, 1870s today. So the Kapital was not a great success, but it was an influential book. So much to say, and then we go to intellectual history, that Marx died in 1883, no longer being in political touch with the proletarian movement. He was well respected, but he was no longer very active. He wasn't running any. Being a philosopher, not in the academic world, but in the political world, of high prestige. One of those people said, one day you have to read him because there's an interesting potential there. But he clearly died in 1883 before any reception was happening that one might call Marxism. Yeah? Before Marxist writings became Marxism. And I think one can say there are two surprises. If he would know that today, March 29, 2017, there would be a seminar on his work at Tbilisi, he would be totally astonished that he had such a long sustainability and survival. I think he would be very, very astonished. And I think he would be much more astonished to know that this country, Georgia, was a Soviet republic, and to learn what a Soviet republic was and how this was related to Marxism, etc. This was not something he expected. I'm not saying because he didn't expect it wasn't legitimate. I want to say he died not in despair. He didn't have a bad life. He was not unsuccessful. But he had never even begun to have the political impact that was a motivation for him. Okay? Now let me go to a different context and say something, and that's the third part, about the intellectual environment. I think both Hegel's philosophy, which became the matrix of Marxist thought, really, mainly of the history of the class struggle. I'm not saying it's the matrix of the Kapital. And Marx's own philosophy would have been unthinkable without what I call the historical worldview. Now, the historical worldview is, I wouldn't call it an ideology, because it was not built or invented to be coherent. I mean, it is a worldview that emerged since the third quarter of the 18th century, out of the context of European Enlightenment, and that was so heavily institutionalized around 1830, which is a relatively short time, that people in the Western world thought this is natural. This is the correct worldview. This is how we have to see the world. Is that clear? Now let me very briefly give you an impression. And if you haven't heard it last year, it's a different version, and I think this is the important point of how this happened. I think at the beginning of the emergence of the historical worldview is a development in which a small group of 18th century Central European society began to be habitually self-reflexive, self-observing in the act of world observation. That means you cannot help observing yourself while you're observing the world. This is what I mean by habitual. And what group was that? I think it was the group who called themselves in the 18th century, in the koiné, in the general language of the 18th century in French, les philosophes. But les philosophes in 18th century language is the exact semantic equivalent of intellectual today. Yeah, the relatively small group of intellectuals, those who carried enlightenment, people like Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, became habitually self-reflexive. Why, I think nobody knows, but you can observe that. You can observe that in writings. You can actually, I have a colleague in Stanford who has done that even with digital humanities, which I hate, but you can prove that in French, English, German texts out of the 18th century, starting in 1750, 1760, there are more self-reflexive expressions. When people observe the world, they observe themselves in the act of observing the world. Now, this has two consequences. This has two consequences, and we can document these consequences. One consequence is that somebody who observes himself or herself in the act of self-observation becomes aware that the result of the world observation, the experience that she is making or he is making, depends on the point of view. I mean, if I stand here, I see you differently when I stand there, and so forth. I mean, everybody knows that. So the experience depends on your angle, depends on your perspective. And then you quickly realize that there is a potential infinity of perspectives. I mean, there's an infinity of perspectives in which you can see you and Gigas or your face, which means that for each object of reference, this cup of very good coffee or Gigas glasses, there is an infinity of potential representations. You can see them from here, from here, from here. And that actually is documented, was torturing people in the 18th century. Was driving them absolutely crazy. You get the point? I mean, for each object of reference, there's a potential infinity of representations. I mean, you could say, I like this metaphor, there is an epistemological horror vacui. If the point of reference has an infinity of representations, maybe there is no real point of reference. Yeah, there's actually one case, some of you may know the name Heinrich von Kleist. Who's ever heard of that name? You better have listened to Heinrich von Kleist. He's absolutely my favorite German classic author. Not a very philosophically educated man. He was an artillery officer, but a fantastic officer. And he read 20 pages of Kant, and that drove him into what we would now call a depression today. And he writes to his fiancée, but if I trust Kant, the world has no objects anymore. Do you get this point? So the second problem that emerges from self-observation in the act of world observation is that you realize, if you observe yourself in the act of world observation, that there are two levels of world observation, of world appropriation. World appropriation by concepts. Yeah, you have concepts, and I'm saying you have brown hair, or you have a dark suit. These are concepts. And that's what we call experience. But there's also world observation by the senses. I touch this cup and say it is no longer hot. Yeah? And even without using the word, I would feel it is no longer hot. So there's the second problem. Is there a compatibility between world observation through concepts, experience, and world observation through touch, through the body, what we call perception? You get that? This problem had existed before. We'll also document that. I mean, author I enormously write. I've almost finished a book about, and I talked about last year, Denis Diderot. He was obsessed by this second problem that he called materialism. This is a materialism very different from Marxist materialism. So, all of a sudden you have these two problems, and this drove intellectuals crazy around 1800. Both problems found a very quick solution. The solution of the second problem is a strange one. It doesn't get mentioned anymore. You can really show that in mainstream Western European thought, from the early 19th century on, the question of the compatibility between perception, world appropriation through the body, and experience, world appropriation through concepts, gets eliminated. And how does it get eliminated? It gets eliminated by the growing division between what we call today the humanities. In German you call them the sciences of the spirit on the one hand and the natural sciences on the other hand. So the two separate universes. Decisive for us is the other problem. The problem of polyperspectivism. You have endless representations for each object of reference. Yeah? I mean, could call it the problem of perspectivism. Because that will be the origin of the historical worldview. Now, how does that get resolved? I think it gets resolved by replacing progressively a mirror-like principle of world representation. So there has to be one concept or one image for each object. That is the principle of the encyclopedia, discovery of the 18th century. For each phenomenon you have one article. So the human brain, one article, Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, one article, one representation of everything. To replace this mirror-like principle of world representation by a narrative principle of world representation. We can observe that from the early 19th century on, as a tendency, when people are being asked, what is the Republic of Georgia? The Republic didn't exist. Or what could Germany be around 1820? The answer will be more and more a narrative answer. Instead of saying the territory is such and such, the capital is such and such, like Wikipedia today, people start telling a story. The same is astonishingly true in the sciences. Yeah, from the early 19th century on, evolutionism begins to articulate itself. And if people are asking themselves, what is a horse? Or what is a trout? Or what is a mosquito? They begin to tell the epistemological story of the animal. Or what is the earth? You tell the geological story of the earth, how the earth emerged as a planet. And if you ask, what is the human spirit? And are the young Hegel and write a book about that, and I'm referring to the book, The Phenomenology of the Spirit, you also write a narrative. If you ever read the Phenomenology of the Spirit, you realize that this is the narrative of human education, so to speak. Yeah? How a human person shapes herself and himself as a grown-up. Now, why is a narrative a solution to the problem of polyperspectivism? See, the problem was an infinity of representations for each object of reference, and that was torturing. Is that clear what the problem is? It is a solution for the problem because a narrative allows you to integrate different states, different perspectives on the object. Yeah? So let's say if you have a narrative about Tbilisi, instead of just describing Tbilisi, you can integrate into this narrative the fabulous medieval architecture of Tbilisi. You can integrate new architecture in Tbilisi. You can integrate political history and so forth and so forth. So what I want to say is that a narrative as principle of world representation absorbs and neutralizes the problem of polyperspectivism, the problem of having too many representations, the problem of the epistemological horror-mockery. Is that more or less sinking in? And whenever that happens, I get very envious because it took me about 25 years to figure that out. And if people then, yeah, of course, that's it. But I'm very happy if you think, yeah, that's it. So that makes sense to you, more or less? Now this is the basis of what I call the historical worldview, and I describe the historical worldview when we get to Hegel. So the historical worldview is the worldview that you have all learned at school to be, if you don't say Western culture, then global culture. It was the worldview that was brand new when Marx was beginning to think, when Hegel was getting old, it was the worldview that Hegel was first spelling out. But I also believe, in anticipation of tomorrow's session, it is a worldview that is now fading away. I think it is still maintained at the university, in politics, but it is not the way we think in the everyday. Okay. Now, in this historical worldview, in the first place, we believe that we leave the past behind ourselves. The past is receding. Past never loses its orientational value, but the further away the past is, the less valuable is its orientational value. We would not exclude that we can learn something from ancient Egypt, but we would say it is very unlikely that we can learn more from ancient Egypt than, say, from the Soviet Union, or from the bad example of the Soviet Union. Is that clear? So, we leave the past behind. Secondly, the historical worldview is a worldview in which we believe that the future is an open horizon of possibilities that we can shape, that we can create. Yeah? So in the present, we can shape the future. You realize that is the beginning, the condition of what we call democratic politics. Yeah, whenever there's an election campaign, politicians promise this is the future that they will shape. Is that clear? Thirdly, between that past that we leave behind and that future that we believe we can shape, the present is an imperceptibly short moment of transition. We normally think the present has no substance. It is a moment of transition. And fourthly, we believe that in this present, as Cartesian subjects, as consciousness, based on experience from the past adapted to the present, we choose among the possibilities of the future. So the present is the place where we shape the future. This is what politics promises. In the present, you shape the future. And it is implied we can do that. We can shape the future. We can choose the future. Once again, this is what every electoral campaign promises. So here's party X promises this future, here's another party promises another future, and you can choose what you want. Whether we believe it, it's interesting to see your faces. You all look like saying, nobody believes that anymore. I agree with you, I don't believe it either. But it is the official condition of democratic politics. I mean, and I don't think that elections are rigged in every country. I mean, we had a very bad surprise in the United States recently, but I think the election of Trump proves above all that elections are not predetermined by some, I mean, things can happen. Yeah, and as you all know, he promised this glorious future, let's make America great again, whatever that means. But that is typical for democratic election. Finally, this worldview implies that time is a necessary agent of change. That no phenomenon can resist transformation in time. That transformation may go more slowly or more quickly, but all phenomena change in time. Yeah? This is what we call the historical worldview. This becomes so centrally institutionalized around 1830 that Western culture until the present day believes that's time in and by itself. That is history, capital H. That is the precondition for what we call evolutionism, but it is also the precondition for what we call philosophy of history. It is the precondition for what we call politics. It is the precondition of socialism. There is no socialism without the belief that you can shape the future, but it is also the precondition for capitalism. There is no capitalism without a future being open for economic growth. Yeah, it is very strange. This is everything we can think of in Western culture, European culture, since the early 19th century depends on the historical worldview. Yeah, I think this is why it is so centrally institutionalized, and this is why we all have gone through it and have kind of drunk it, and it has become part of our understanding of the world. Is that clear, this description? Now, the philosopher, as I said, who spelled out this worldview in the most explicit way was Hegel. You can actually say that, you know, Hegel's lifetime is contemporaneous with the emergence of the historical worldview. And if the historical worldview had remained what the French like to call une mentalité, I mean something that everybody shares as a pattern of thought, but without contours, without central concepts, that could have happened, but Hegel was the one who transformed the historical worldview into, I wouldn't call it an ideology, because it was not meant to have a historical impact, but into a coherent conceptual system. That is Hegel's philosophy of history. Yeah, that is Hegel's philosophy of history that became so important for Marx. Now, how does that philosophy of history go? I think in the first place, it dwells on the distinction between spirit and matter. The basic distinction is the distinction between spirit and matter. Interestingly, the active part is the spirit. Yeah, the matter in this distinction is the passive part. The matter never does much. The matter is a point of departure and a point of return. The matter is always shaped and impacted by the spirit. So that people have been saying, and I think it's true, it was maybe not Hegel's intention, that the spirit in that construction is the masculine part, and the matter is the feminine part. I mean, I'm not saying this is how I think about men and women, but in an ideological prejudice. I mean, also the grammatically in ancient Greek that would fit, because Schule, which would be the concept for matter, would be feminine. Die Materie in German is also feminine. Der Geist, I mean, spirit is masculine. You get? I mean, so the spirit is always active. Secondly, what is the central mythology? And the central mythology, as most of you know, is that in primordial times, at the beginning of the world, at an ideal beginning, spirit and matter are one. They are unseparated. And secondly, for some unexplained reason, the unrestful spirit separates itself from matter, and in a long trajectory, and this long trajectory is what we call world history, or history capital H, reunites with matter again. But reunites with matter again in a different quality, because if in the original state, spirit and matter in their union didn't have an awareness of themselves, in the final state, when they are reunited again, they will have a self-reflexivity. Yeah? They will have a place where they can see that they are united again after a long time of not being united. And thirdly, Hegel was modest enough to call this the end of history. So when spirit and matter are united again in a reflexive way, that will be the end of history. And he believed that it was his philosophy that was the end of history. Yeah? That in his philosophy, matter and spirit had become reunited again in a reflexive way. Yeah? And the reflexive way is precisely to write this philosophy. Fourth and final point, how does this trajectory happen? It happens in a specific rhythm that nobody before Hegel had really invented, in a rhythm that Hegel calls dialectics, and you've all heard about it. And the rhythm is that there is an itineration of a development into which you have a thesis, and the thesis means one position, and once you have the thesis you automatically have an antithesis, the opposite position, and then you have as a third position a synthesis in which thesis and antithesis are united. This is also called sublimation. And then you move on. And that's the progress of history, so to speak, and you realize this is a very parsimonious householding principle. Nothing gets lost. I mean, there is a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and that means nothing gets excluded. So the world history is also a process of growing complexity. It gets more and more complex, and in the end, everything is redeemed by becoming self-reflexive. Okay? Now, this is Hegelianism of the right. This is Hegelianism that, according to Hegel, believes that history has come to an end in Hegel. What Marx was exposed to when he came to Berlin in 1835 was precisely this type of philosophy. There were many philosophers teaching at the University of Berlin in the same building that most of you have seen in Berlin, unter den Linden. The building that you see when you walk along under den Linden to the left from the Brandenburg Gate is really the building where Hegel was teaching. But in that same building, after Hegel's death in 1831, there were Hegel students teaching. But many of them were saying Hegel was right about everything except that history has not come to an end yet, except that history is still open, and we have to see, we are empowered to see how we can bring history to an ending. Yeah? Okay, and that is, do you understand, that is precisely Marx's position. And what I would like to describe now in concluding is both the history of the class struggle and later on the Kapital as attempts by Marx to work with this Hegelian matrix. So that would be part 3 and 4 of my exposition, but don't fear, this is going to last another, I would say, 15 minutes. Okay? So, what is specific about Marx's reaction to Hegel's philosophy, and I refer here to the time between 1835 and 1848. In the first place, Marx has an obsession with practical application. Yeah, I mean, there's this famous sentence by the young Marx, philosophers so far have always been interpreting the world. The important thing is to change it. I mean, today I believe most of us would be more pessimistic about that. Can philosophers really change the world? But you have to remember, in his preface of his dissertation, which is from that time, he says, as soon as you bring the world in contact with philosophy, philosophy will change the world. So he had a strong belief that philosophy almost, you know, as I'm saying, almost like a radiation, I mean, almost like a chemotherapy can change a health situation or a cancer, so philosophy can change the world. Secondly, Marx has an obsession with concreteness. And this is also basically this obsession with turning Hegel upside down. He realizes that what matters in Hegel, the active part in Hegel's mythology, I call it a mythology because it is a beautiful narrative, what Hegel says about world history. I think it has zero empirical evidence, but it is a beautiful story invented. And I'm not saying it's useless, but you get my point. I mean, it is as empirically valid as the Old Testament. I mean, yeah, I mean that there was a unity of matter and spirit at the beginning, and then spirit departed. We have all heard that endless times, but what's the evidence of that? I mean, that Hegel has said it, and that ever since it has been part of the curriculum of philosophy department, not much more. So Marx wants things to, in the second place, to be more concrete. Yeah? And this is this turning upside down. You have to turn Hegel from standing on his head to standing on his feet. And this is why matter has to really matter and spirit has to be secondary. He did not mean that in the sense of what I've been mentioning before about grammatical gender as a feminist emancipation. That clearly had not in mind. It was just about the real thing has to matter. Yeah? So this is why Marx insists that the material circumstances, matter, shapes the spirit and not the other way around. This is why in every instance, it is not just these concepts, Marx is always insisting on the concrete. I would even say that after the failure of the history of the class struggle, 1848, the fact that he goes to the British Library and checks out accounting documents instead of reading philosophy, instead of reading theory, which I find very fascinating, is this insistence, this obsession with the concrete. Yeah, and as most of you know better than I do, concreteness continued to be a value in Marxism. Not that Marxism was very concrete, but there was a theory about it had to be concrete. Thirdly, and I think this is very, very important, and I feel hardly ever mentioned in Marxism, Marx, without really saying it, replaces the concept of matter that had been very, very important in the 18th century, in 18th century materialism. And 18th century materialism was really about matter. Like, why does this get warm when I'm rubbing my skin like this? Or why do you die or why your body will be destroyed if you jump 100 meters from a tower and so forth. I mean, that type of materialism. When Marx says materialism, and he does that for the first time in his thesis on the philosopher Feuerbach, who was a materialist in the old sense. When Marx says materialism, he means something different. He means circumstances of production, circumstances of economic production, organizational circumstances of economic production, including class relationships. So you get my point, this is what we would call today a sociological concept. Yeah? I mean, say circumstances of production is a sociological, if you want, an economic concept, but it is certainly not a concept of science as the concept of the 18th century. I'm not saying this is bad, I'm not saying he's wrong, I'm only saying that the word materialism in Marx has nothing to do with 18th century materialism. It also has, maybe fortunately, absolutely nothing to do with what Hegel understood by materialism. Yeah? I mean, it is not a materialism whose reunification with the spirit you could discuss. It is a materialism, a word materialism that refers to social and organizational structures. Is that clear? Fourthly, and most importantly, and this again goes under the premise of concretization. So, what does Marx make out of the dialectics? Yeah? I mean, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This becomes the basis, the rewriting of this, of the history, or I would say the mythology of the class struggle. Yeah? Marx interprets the logical tension between thesis and antithesis, or translates that into tensions between social classes. So he replaces what is a concept, thesis, and a counter-concept, antithesis, by historical classes, and he replaces the logical tension between them by a social and political and economic tension between them. And he replaces the logical reunification of them, synthesis or sublevation, by the step of a revolution. Yeah, so a revolution, and this is also Marx, never meaning that you exclude the previously dominant class, but the previously dominant class will become part of a new society. My point? So I think it is obvious as a term of concretization, the way that Marx translates Hegelian dialectics in the mythology, in the history of the class struggle. So you can see the Hegelian matrix, but the semantics become very different. As a remark, I would say that the history of the class struggle during the 19th and the first half of the 20th century has unfolded an enormous motivational power. Many people have believed in that. Many people believed that they had to make a contribution to that historical secularity. At the same time, I think it was individually demotivating. Think about previous generations in this country. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because it was part of Marxism to say that this process will happen anyway. This process is independent from individual effort. So why would you make an individual effort if this process would happen anyway? I mean, you get my point? It's very difficult to motivate somebody who believes in the history of class struggle. I mean, I think at the beginning many people embraced that, felt that was a good way to think about life. But if it came to personal contribution, say it's going to happen anyway, why should I make a contribution? Finally, what became the telos of this story? I mean, in Hegel's philosophy, it was, of course, the reunification of spirit and matter on a level of reflection. In Marx, it becomes the class-free society. In Marx, it becomes the class-free society, and as I know that some of you have been brought up in Marxism, I would like for you to think about the following: whether you ever had an image of what a class-free society would be. And this is a real question, because my experience from reading Marx and from this seminar is that this concept remains very pale. It is not clear what Marx really imagined a class-free society to be. I mean, there is an insistence it would be a more simple society, a more elementary society, a society where everything would fall into place, or a society where you would not have internal tensions or struggles. It is, however, a concept that, with one exception, Marx never associated with sensuality, for example. God forbid. There's one single passage in the Grundrisse where he says sexuality in a class-free society may be as promiscuous as in prostitution. Not bad, but for starters. But you get my point. I mean, the point I want to make is that, in my view, but maybe you have a different view, one of the failures of Marxism is that ultimately there was never an effort made, there was no genius author who would ever paint out, give you an image why the class-free society would be so desirable. Why you should make an effort towards a class-free society. Okay, you have patience enough for not so many more minutes. I want to finish by explaining why I believe that the second and unfinished part of Marx's work, Das Kapital, has very little philosophical and epistemological continuity with the history of the class struggle. I mean, I will try to explain more tomorrow how what I have described in the past 10-15 minutes, the mythology or the ideology of the class struggle, was what became Marxism. And that while Marxism was constantly invoking the Capital was actually not much part of Marxism, was, if at best, a marginal part of Marxism. So this is, I mean, my basic thesis would be that the project of Das Kapital, and the project of all the late economic writings of Marx, including the famous Grundrisse that were only published for the first time in 1905 in the pre-Soviet Union, that this was a systemic analysis of economy, an analysis of capitalistic economy from a systemic point of view. Systemic in the sense that Saussure's linguistics is not a historical analysis of language, but an analysis of language as a system. And in that sense, I believe that Marx's Kapital is an analysis of capitalistic economy from a systemic point of view, and therefore largely incompatible with the historical point of view of the history of class struggle. And I think, and I could prove that textually, you can see that whenever Marx tries to establish a continuity between the history of the class struggle and the Kapital, he gets into trouble. Yeah? These two parts are epistemologically, I would go so far to say, in principle incompatible. I'm not saying that this is the reason why they both failed. I'm not saying, but there is no possible mediation. I mean, you can describe a phenomenon diachronically or synchronically, but to my knowledge, all attempts, and there have been attempts to create a harmony or a convergence between systemic and diachronic analysis have failed. One proof, that's my second point, of why the Kapital is a systemic approach is the obsession of Marx to identify the central element of economy, the central element of Marxism, and not of Marxism, the central element of capitalism. Yeah, if you have a systemic analysis, you find the same in Saussure. There is no answer. What is the central element of language? But there are discussions. Is it a word? Is it a sentence? Is it a syntactic structure? And so forth and so forth. So Marx, in the second place in the Kapital, is obsessed with the question, what is the systemic basic element of economy, especially of capitalistic economy? And his answer is commodity, die Ware. Now, what is the concept of commodity? Commodity is every object which becomes an intersection of values. Yeah? Say, for example, you have my watch here, and this watch becomes a commodity from the moment on that you say it is an intersection between the personal value from me, because it was a present from my wife for our anniversary. It has it's a very good watch, it's a Swiss watch, so it has a monetary value. It has a use value for me. Its use value is not higher than that of a watch that costs 1,000 times less, of a Swatch or something like that. It has an aesthetic value. There's a misunderstanding, there is no finite number of values. When you regard something as a commodity, it can become the intersection of an infinity of values. And this, a commodity defined as the intersection of an infinity of values, is what Marx regards as the central element of an economy, as the central element of capitalism. I think here you can see again the obsession with value. Not that there is one value to this watch, but can I say what is the relation between the emotional value that this watch has for me, the monetary value that it has, the aesthetic value that it has, etc., etc. Yeah? This is Marx's central obsession, commodity. You may have heard the concept of value fetishism. Who knows the concept of value fetishism? It's a Marx concept. Value fetishism is not a critique of evil capitalists, but value fetishism is a critique of not so intelligent intellectuals. Yeah, Marx says value fetishism, or value fetishist, is the person that believes that each object has one intrinsic value and that is the only value. Yeah, it says, no, that does not exist. I mean, these glasses, like my watch, like the clothes you are wearing, like your shoes, but also like your body, is an intersection of many, many potential values. And it is precisely this character of being an intersection that makes them a commodity, a potential commodity. And of course your bodies are potential commodities. You don't have to prostitute yourself in a male or female way to make your body a commodity. Your body is a commodity because it is already a potential intersection of different values. It could, for example, if you have an anomaly, I don't know that I have any anomaly specifically, but I could have one, then, for example, your body has a potential value as an object for medical research. Yeah? All these values come together. Commodity fetishism is what Marx calls the naive attitude to believe that objects have one and only one intrinsic value. Yeah, if you say a certain territory downtown Tbilisi should never cost more than whatever, 500,000 euros, €500,000, and if people get €1 million for it, that would be very evil and immoral. Many people of the left today say that, but according to Marx, that is stupid. According to Marx, that is commodity fetishism. That is to believe that there's an inherent value. I'm saying that because this is very funny. This is a very typical left-wing attitude today, that certain type of work, certain type of commodity should only have one value, at least never more. No? There's an obsession with highest salaries to be paid in socialist states. Nobody should earn more for operation of appendicitis than $500. Marx would be absolutely against that. I mean, he insists on the fairness of the value. You should try and figure out what is justice of value in comparison to others, but there is no unique value. That would be commodity fetishism. Is that clear? Thirdly, and I find that also a very, very interesting development of Capital, you hardly find the way, I mean, as you know, Capital is unfinished. The more the text develops, you hardly find a reference to the proletariat as a class anymore. Yeah, the tendency of Capital, I mean, Capital is not a book about tensions between different social classes. He analyzes conditions of economic production, but always from an economic point of view, and in that sense, the concept of proletariat is progressively replaced by the concept of labor force. Labor force not in the collective sense, but in the sense of what is the potential energy that your body plus your skills, you can be a skilled worker, an unskilled worker, could contribute for a certain type of function, for a certain type of work. Yeah? So you don't appear as an individual in that theory. Classes don't appear as the origin of social tensions or political movements, but you appear to use that metaphor as a battery that you can charge and recharge, as a battery of labor force, and that labor force can be parceled. I mean, you can have shortage of labor force, you can have too much labor force, and so forth. Okay, tendentially, I would say, and that has been our experience, trying experimentally to use concepts from the Capital to this new phenomenon of Uber. Marx's theory from the Capital is still
well, between amazing, fantastic, I don't know if it's fantastic, but quite sharp toolkit of economic analysis today. I think it works quite well in this sense, and in that sense it is not so surprising that you find a lot of concepts invented by Marx in economic theory today that would never consider itself to be left-wing or Marxist or socialist. Yeah, these concepts function quite well. If you could say that the main problem of Marxist theory of the class struggle, in my view at least, this is my view, is that he never managed to really illustrate what would be so desirable about a class-free society. Why would you want to live in a class-free society? I don't know whether you have ever asked yourself whether you want or not, but presuppose you want to live in a class-free society. Why? Why would your life be better in a class-free society? What is so bad about social classes, actually? I mean, if you feel repressed, yes, but, you know, for example, parents are very difficult to replace, and they will always be a source of repression, for example. So, I think the equivalent problem, and this is almost funny and ironic, of the Kapital is that Marx never found a good answer to the question why capitalism should vanish, should shipwreck, should not be successful. The main element in the Kapital, the central cell, as he calls it metaphorically, is the commodity. And the main agent in Kapital, in the book Kapital, is capital, is Kapital. And it has the role of the agent. It's not the capitalists that are the agent. Kapital is the agent. And why is Kapital is the agent? Because, says Marx, Kapital is condemned to grow. It will always grow, and it will always consist in a transformation of capital into money, of money into capital. What is the distinction between money and capital? The distinction is that money is that which you have on your banking account, or in your pocket, or today as your credit card allowance. That is all money. Capital is something that you constantly reinvest. You constantly reinvest, you constantly accept debt to have a higher yield. So capital is condemned to grow. And I think, this is at least my reading in the last chapters that Marx wrote about the Kapital, the work is unfinished, it becomes increasingly desperate about this question, so how could one explain that capital or capitalism is doomed to die? Yeah? He tries to say that short supply is bad. So when capital doesn't provide the merchandise that people need, so many Georgians want to buy cars, and the European car industry cannot provide enough cars, which clearly, seeing Tbilisi today is not the main problem. Then Marx says maybe capitalism dies out of oversupply. That, you know, one sector produces too much merchandise and there's no market for it, and then the factory goes bankrupt, and that is the collapse of capitalism. We all know that this happens, but as capitalism is brutal, I mean, in a jungle way, in an evolutionary way, we know that economies survive that really well. There is a German proverb, Totgesagte leben länger. Those whose death has been announced will survive. And that is the rule of capitalism. I mean, how long have Western intellectuals have been talking of late capitalism? So as if the last chapter of capitalism had been announced, the bell is ringing, there's little time left. I mean, as far as I can see, fortunately or unfortunately, after all, I come from the quote-unquote promised land of capitalism. It is alive and kicking. And many, many things that have been predicted to die soon have been, to never die, like socialism, have been dying. But I'm not singing here the triumphant song of capitalism. I'm saying, and this is now my thesis, and this is the last sentence, that if I look at it from a reception history point of view, the key problem of Marxism, as long as it was history of class struggle, is to never have developed an image that made the class-free society really desirable, let alone plausible. Whether it was ever plausible that this should arrive is yet a different question, but I thought it was also not undesirable. It was just, as you say in American English, nondescript. You get my point? I mean, it's not, what would that possibly be? Why should we, this is what Albert Camus wrote in the 1950s, why would one sacrifice lives for a class-free society if we have no imagination what that would possibly be? And I think the functionally equivalent problem of Marx's second production of the Capital is that for all the discourse that socialism produced of the decadence of capitalism being doomed to die, of the ultimate victory of communism over capitalism, there was never any good reason to describe why capitalism should die. What would be the key problem of capitalism? Now, not because I believe that capitalism is so naturally strong, not because I believe that Marx was not intelligent, but because a synchronic analysis of a phenomenon does not and will never produce a reason why the phenomenon should die. I mean, think again about Saussure's theory of language. Saussure's theory of language can beautifully describe how a language can function, but it will not even begin to describe why a language should change, let alone why certain languages vanish. We know that languages vanish. I'm not excluding that capitalism will disappear one day, but you will not find a motivating reason why it will appear with a synchronic analysis, which at the same time, referring to Das Kapital, I personally consider to be the more admirable part of Marx's work. I think the Kapital is an amazing, amazing work. If we ask tomorrow what is left, I mean things that one can still use today, I go much more for the Kapital than for the history of the class struggle. But in its political context, in its political working, it was unfortunate, because it doesn't contain a potential to predict that this will come to an end. Okay, I mean, I thank you for your mega angelical patience. I mean, you're really all... And if you're even more patient, maybe somebody has a question, then you are redeemed. Yeah?
We know that he took this idea of world history from Hegel, like Philosophie der Geschichte. I mean, according to Hegel.
Yeah, all of Hegel.
He says that history is nothing more than an expression of God's will, and this is the overall Geist which makes the history in the world go round. So, what happened to this idea in Marx's works? Because here in Georgia and in the Soviet Union, like Marxism and atheism were the synonyms. They believed that Marx was atheist, and they referred to...
Yeah, no, Marx, I mean, I could have said that Marx wanted to be an atheist himself, and that was part, and that was the place in my lecture of his concreteness.
Yes,
I mean, turning Hegel from the head to the feet, upside down, meant to make matter, and as I was saying, it's not very clear what he understands by matter, the agent, so to speak. I think the hope that Marx had there, but he never elaborated that, was something similar to Darwinian evolutionism. I'm not saying Darwin specifically, but that matter would have a natural unfolding of itself and therefore it would be matter that drives world history. Please don't think that I believe that. I'm just trying to imagine what Marx imagined.
Yeah, so does it mean that he simply disregarded that part of Hegel's philosophy, I mean, about the Geist and about the God's will, like expressed in nature, or?
Yeah, he wouldn't feel disregard. I mean, and in that sense, in a way, I admire Marx. I always feel when young generations just repeat what the older generation has formulated and adore it and reconstruct it and rehash it, that is always non-productive. I mean, I felt in general that Marx's relationship to who was the great philosophical authority of his time, to Hegel, namely to understand Hegel perfectly. I mean, he was clearly a very good reader of Hegel, and then to do something different. I mean, basically, as a gesture, admire that. Yeah? Why would he be obliged to think the same way Hegel would thinking? But I do think there's an important potential in your question, and that is the potential that does Marx in general not underestimate the political and historical power of what we could refer to as intellectual and spiritual production. I mean, when late in the game in 1851, he introduces the distinction between infrastructure and superstructure. Superstructure meaning culture. The only function that culture is assigned is to slow down the rhythm of the class struggle. So it's not a positive function. And I think this is why Marxist aesthetics was so relatively poor, because the only function that art in Marxism could ever had was to make evidence what you would know anyway. Namely, that the proletariat would one day victoriously finish the history of class struggles, that the working class was morally superior, and so forth, and so forth. You know? I mean, I'm talking of state Marxism. So you're pointing to a weakness in Marxist theory. I completely agree with you. And I would say not only because he disregarded the theological implications in Hegel, but because he was so obsessed with what the young Marx called concreteness. Yeah? And because he believed that everything spiritual was abstract, and by being abstract, not practical enough. Yeah? And this, of course, turned out to be rhetorically very powerful for 150 years, and for many people still today. But I agree with you, it is one of the great weaknesses of Marxism. And probably of Marx, not only of Marxism.
You know, there is a very fashionable term currently, which is called neoliberalism.
Yes.
So sometimes people use it as an exchange word for capitalism, sometimes in other meanings. And do you find any use for the term? And what use do you think it has, let's say, in humanities and social sciences currently?
To explain what is meant by the word, of course it is normally used by people who consider themselves to be of the left as a very evil and condemning word for new capitalism, for new wild capitalism. That's what neoliberalism is. And for most Western intellectuals, I mean, read something like the New York Review of Books, very respectable bi-monthly journal, so that appears in New York, but there's nothing worse than neoliberalism. I think neoliberalism refers to the fact that in Europe, as we discussed today, you and I, something has become normal and institutionalized that I call social democratism. So this is not to be confused with socialism, nor with social democratic parties. I think that in all EU countries today, and as you are now an EU country, that is maybe your future, parties that are eligible, parties whose voters will not get excused to be extremists, should rather go to jail, like if you vote communist or if you vote fascist, and there's a fascist part in Italy, for example, that parties from the middle to the middle left and middle right they have a social democratistic consensus. I call it social democratistic. And that means basically that you agree on a compromise between a market economy but a constrained market economy. A market economy with very high contours given by the state. You have comparably very high taxes. The country with the lowest taxes in Europe is not in the EU, that is Switzerland. So you have high taxes, you have high regulatory power by the state, you have high expectations towards the state, expectations in terms of retirement payments, expectations in terms of health security, and so forth and so forth. So that is what I call social democratism, and that works relatively well for Europe, for EU Europe. And some people think it works so well, and here's my point now, that it is the natural life form, and it gains a normative plausibility. So if you do not embrace social, you have to be a pacifist too, and you have to be ecological. These would be other contents of social democratism. And who does not embrace that is an evil person and a neoliberal. Yeah? This is how neoliberalism is used. So I would say neoliberalism is used as the counter-concept to a life form that has many Marxist elements without being Marxism. I mean, social democratism is not synonymous with Marxism by no means, but it is very coherent, and I think its strength is that it has never become an ideology. Yeah, there is no party that stands for social democratistic values. Some stand for social values, and there's a Christian Democratic Party, and so forth and so forth. And the collective counter-concept, the collective evil, that is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the capitalistic conspiracy. And I think the word is very difficult to pinpoint. Yeah, it has no contoured semantics. It is used for everything that is outside the social democratic consensus. Yeah, for example, from the moment on that you say that you find that the tax progression is very high, you are neoliberal. From the moment on that you say that university students should pay tuition, you are terribly neoliberal. From the moment on you say that there should not be a high sales tax, and so forth and so forth. So I think it is similarly vague to what I call social democratism, and it is the leftist other of social, I mean, it accuses the rightist other of social democracy. Do you want to go home in the name of social, yeah?
So you noted that...
a little bit louder.
Okay. So you noted that capital is a very brilliant analysis of capitalism by Marx, but this Hegelian influenced class struggle theory has some problems. So my question is, did Marx overlook in his analysis of capitalism that the crisis of the capitalism, the cycles, could become the part of the capitalist system, not really as in what he has in his theory of class struggle, the end of the system, but this part of the system, and he just, I don't know, did he have really this contradiction between his two sides, or to say was he Marxist enough?
Fantastic question. I mean, I think this is the most important question about Marxism, and what you can do with it. My hunch, as you say in American English, I mean, what I believe is that Marx, towards the end of his life, and towards the end of his writing on the Capital, had an impression, a hunch, an inkling, that there was a problem of bringing the theory, history, philosophy of class struggle and Capital together. because there is an increasing number of paragraphs in the last chapters of Capital where it tries to prove that the end of the Capital is natural, and thereby he gets into a narrative. You get my point? I mean, my basic argument for the incompatibility is the synchronic and the diachronic axis. And I basically believe that you cannot get them together. You can do one or you can do the other, but they are not really compatible. There's no continuity. So I have the impression, I kind of know that Marx would not have been able to formulate this problem because this distinction that we can make synchronic, diachronic was not available with that clarity this time. But he had an inkling that there was a difficulty. Secondly, I think much of both state Marxism and revisionist Marxism, I mean intellectual positions inspired by Marxism without being state institutions, try to solve the problem exactly in the way that you suggested, namely trying to explain that there were inherent cycles in capitalism, and that these inherent cycles had an inherent necessity to go into the vanishing, to the decadence of the capitalist system. I mean, that's clear to observe. I mean, Althusser was mentioned before was one of them, because Althusser was basically much more interested in the synchronic Marx, the structuralist Marx, but he tried to show that there was a necessary human end. To be honest, I mean, this was what I was saying. I believe that there is no solution to this problem. I mean, at the same time, so I believe there's no solution to the problem because the synchronic and the diachronic analysis are incompatible. Not that Marx started out the Capital saying, now I do synchrony, but he happened to do so. At the same time, if you ask me, I'm of course by no means convinced that any type of Hegelianism is still possible today. That we can go back in history, analyze regularity in history, and then project that into the future. So here is the necessary future of the Republic of Georgia. I mean, I would actually say that the moment that somebody tries to do that under present day conditions, I would call him an demagogue. I don't think that functions, and we have known, we have experienced for 150 years that functions. So get my point. I mean, I have two reasons why I don't believe in the analysis of regularities in history. A, that's incompatible with synchronicity, but B, I also don't believe in it when I read such prognostics. I mean, I don't know, is there anybody who knows about economy? It has been made over and again that there are regularities in capitalist economy. And my impression is that absolutely nobody has ever really done any good prognostics based on it. I mean, you can develop beautiful retrospective theory. But, I mean, I don't know whether anybody knows, but it seems to be a consensus in people who do economic history that until the present day, there is no consensus about the reasons of the implosion of world economy in 1929. There are several competing theories, but there is not consensus to say this is the reason why the implosion of the world economic system in 1929 happened. I mean, if not for a lack of intelligence, but if we are not able to retrospectively reconstruct the necessity, how should we claim that there is a prospect of necessity? So you better keep your economy going. Just buy merchandise. I have no recipe. It's also not. It's not what I mean, I can think about synchronic and diachronic systems, but I have no confidence in those. Okay, shall we call it an evening? I think